Hello, my name's Terry Byers. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Melbourne in Australia. I am also the Director of Innovation and Learning at the Anglican Church Grammar School, or Churchy, in Brisbane. I'm making this presentation on behalf of my co-supervisors, Dr. Elizabeth Hartnell-Young and Dr. Wes Imms from the University of Melbourne. This presentation will cover a study that has used empirical evidence as a mechanism to support and track teacher pedagogical change as they have made the transition from traditional to more contemporary learning environments. This study sought to investigate how teachers change their pedagogy, the student groupings, and the use of technology in two different learning environments, and how it changed in the transition from a traditional workshop or art studio to a new generation learning space. There were two earlier studies conducted at Churchy in association with the University of Melbourne that looked at the effect of this change on student perceptions of their learning engagement, their learning experiences, and ultimately the effect on learning outcomes in maths and in English. Those two studies produced positive empirical evidence that suggest that something occurs in the teaching and learning process in these new environments. And the hypothesis of this particular study was that these positive effects on student perceptions and improvements in learning outcomes is due to changes that teachers make in the pedagogy they use, how they arrange their students, how they use technology, and the learning experiences that they create for their students as an explanation. The overarching research question was, to what extent and in what ways does the attributes of and synergy between the physical learning environment and the affordance of digital technology affect the teaching and learning process? So basically, if we design a space that looks at working with the affordances of digital technology, is there an effect on the teaching and learning process versus a traditional layout in which the digital technology is present? The assumption that we're looking at here is the traditional layout, which is what we would see quite often, is a single classroom with four walls where you have a front-centric teacher position that might be delineated by a teacher desk, a front center display such as a whiteboard, interactive whiteboard, or data projector screen, where the students are arranged facing that front centric position. When you go from that environment to these new generation learning spaces, which will be explained on the next slide, what happens to teacher and student use and its effective use of digital technology, and does this move have any effect on the learning experiences of the students in the class? And what we're looking for is, we're not looking for one type of pedagogy. What we're looking for is a range of pedagogies and a range of learning experiences. And the term that we're using for this presentation and the current work is the multiplicitous characteristics of student-centered learning. And what that's looking for is not an either-or of different pedagogical modes, but of a continuum from what would be termed traditional or teacher-directed instruction through to active learning, more collaboration where the teacher is the facilitator of the learning experience. So what we see here is a comparison through an animation between a traditional and a new generation learning space. So this is a traditional space as we've conceptualized it for the study. It's fairly common, and the fact is that there'll be a front-centric teacher position Now, this position is termed by Reynard 2009 as a fireplace. The fact is, over time it becomes instilled in students that the teacher's position is at the front of the room, and they're arranged looking at that front-centric position. Basically what we're looking at is that in many cases the teacher will stay at the front. They will rarely move, and if they do, it's superficial movement, but they'll generally stay at the front, and they'll generally undertake direct instruction using more teacher-centric pedagogy. Also, with this particular model, it looks at the notion of a factory or spatiality of a factory classroom where basically knowledge is finite. It's the teacher's job to disseminate the knowledge to the students. The students get filled up with the knowledge. Some students get the knowledge, some of them get half, and some get none. And I suppose this is a fairly traditional mindset of the teaching and learning process. And in this space, it's very hard to do things that are different, such as group work, different groups, different activities, differentiated learning, without some massive effort by the teacher. And so what we're looking at here is there a better way to arrange the room with the affordances of technology to actually facilitate more engaging and dynamic learning. So with the animation, what you'll notice is that all these other little blue rectangles, and they're what we use in a polycentric layout. So rather than being only one central focal point, now there are multiple, and Peter Lippmann uses the term polycentric to mean many focal points. The big thing is that there's active movement around the room, the teacher is moving, students work with different people. So we're looking more at an active pedagogy based on socio-constructivist theory. Students can go inside and outside the classroom, and they can work individually in pairs in the co-construction of understanding. Now, the big thing here is that this is what we would term a responsive classroom. So it's not an either or, it's an and, where if a teacher wants and feels that direct instruction is the best pedagogical mode for a particular concept, then they would arrange their classroom in such a way. But then if they want to break and work in small groups, then the classroom must be able to allow students and teachers to move freely around, work together with different people at different times and in different modes. And what we're looking at is also the outside the classroom, trying to extend the walls of the classroom to encompass a larger area, therefore more different learning environments. So the study took place during the refurbishment of two existing buildings at Churchie. One of them was Hayward, which was the home of the arts faculty, and Midson was the design, technology and engineering faculty. These spaces had a common wall, and there was no flow between the two. You can see from the photos that the workshops were pretty traditional layout, and the art studios were again fairly traditional. And what we're looking at, well, is we've gone from this space to a new space, and what is the effect? So after the refurbishment, what you'll notice is that the learning spaces are different. In this space here, you can see we've got a design lounge with the couches at the front. Then you have the classroom area, which has side benches and different desks, and then you've got the workshop, or the dangerous equipment is all housed within a glass box. And what we see there is that in this space there are multiple learning modalities. You can do teacher-centric, student-centric, or informal, and those modalities come from Ken Fisher. And what we're looking at is providing teachers with the full spectrum to allow their students to work in the best way possible. So this is now that workshop space that you saw in the first two photos. That's now currently what it looks like. This is the arts studio spaces. You can see we have a gallery space, which would have been a hallway, but now it's a learning environment. It's also a space in which the art staff hang a curated set of works, and at various times different student work is on the wall, and it's rotated through. And then you have big glass doors which open up onto the art studios, which basically allows different learning, different modalities in the same lesson. And you can see here that the notion of a single classroom unit or a container has been broken up, because there's actually 3 classes of art occurring at the same time. So by opening up the walls, it means that teachers and students from different classes can interact and work and learn from each other. So the case study, which was the method that we sort of looked at in this particular case, was it involved 11 teachers from the 2 faculties, a total of 14 classes that undertook 42 pre and post occupation paired observations. So the same teacher with the same class. The pre-occupation observations were conducted in the 2014 Term 3 time period, and post-occupation occurred in Term 4 of 2014 and is ongoing at the moment. The methodology was we used a quasi-experimental design where the unit of analysis was the individual teacher. The dependent variables that we're looking for was the notion of pedagogy, communities of learning, so whether it be whole class, paired, small group, mixed class, learning experiences, and teacher and student use of technology. Now within a quasi-experimental design, the aim is to control or moderate the variables so that you can focus on the dependent variables. However, as the study wasn't fully experimental, there was a number of confounding variables, so things like student cognitive ability type and assessment type. And what that basically means is that because we picked particular classes, that introduced those particular variables of student cognitive ability and type and personality type of the student. Also assessment type, the fact is that we had no influence on the assessment that was taking place. It was all existing curriculum. So what we developed was an observational metric, and we call it Linking Pedagogy, Technology in Space, or LPTS. Basically it's a timed Excel spreadsheet that provides a breakdown of teacher and student activity as a percentage of total lesson time. What we wanted to do is to develop a consistent measure across time of the lesson activity. It produced a graphic visual summary at the end of every lesson, and this was shared with individual teachers with accompanying written feedback. The aim with this particular method was to look at, well, what were teachers and students doing. There was little emphasis placed on evaluation. What we wanted to do was just basically look at what were teachers and students doing in the 2 environments, and was it different or was it the same. So this is the observational tool. It's a macroed spreadsheet, and all we're looking for is the observed activity. So if we saw a particular, such as direct instruction, then the direct instruction box gets ticked, and when that activity ceases, then it's unchecked. So again, we're just looking at developing a consistent activity over time. So this is the output from one of the classes, and we broke it down on the domains of teaching, class arrangement, learning activities, and teacher and student technology. And so basically at the end of the lesson, this is shared with the teacher, and it produces a visual breakdown of what we saw as a percentage of time. This was decided because it provides an efficient and effective way of allowing teachers to understand, well, what am I doing in my classroom at that particular lesson in time, and what is the technology being used by both my students and myself. And we also, one of the interesting elements we looked at was student disengagement. So what we looked for was the notion of if more than a quarter of the class were disengaged, then we would tick that box. And what you can see here is this is post inhabitation of the new building, the range of different technologies that we were seeing. And also in terms of that, the learning space became a technology, such as, and also things like pen and paper and the internet and different software packages and cameras and so forth. And we looked at them as technologies similar to the device or the student tablet, teacher's use of data projector, and so forth. So this is basically what happened. On the left hand side, or the yellow bars, are what the arts and design and technology faculty teachers did in their traditional spaces, and the blue grass or the post-inhabitation is what occurred after. And what we're looking for here is basically a comparison. What did these teachers do differently in between the two environments? And what we noticed is there was a trend in less direct instruction, a greater instance of interactive instruction. So that's a demonstration where the teacher is actually engaged in a hands-on activity, demonstrating a particular skill. Because of the styles of subjects, the teacher in the facilitation role were fairly consistent, but we saw a little bit more discussion, a little bit more questioning, and we actually started to see teachers providing individual student feedback. Now that can only occur when the teacher is moving and is much more active in the room and not situated at the front. In terms of student groupings, we saw a lot less whole class work post the inhabitation. We saw more group work. Sometimes the groups were prescribed with the same number and sometimes they were different. And when we looked at mixed groups, that's where there were some students working by themselves, in pairs, or in larger groups. We saw individual work slightly decrease, but that's because we saw much more mixed groupings. And in some cases with the arts, and you saw that with the photo earlier, because we provided a space that enabled the doors and the walls to open up, we actually started to see in classes who might have been different in number, such as 8.1 art and 8.2 art, we actually saw them starting to work in greater collaboration, and we actually saw teachers actually teaching students from different classes, not just their class that's allocated to them. In terms of learning experiences, we saw much more creation, much more building, much more making, much more hands-on activity, less students receiving instruction. We saw much more appraising and refining of work, and obviously these are creative subjects, so they're building something generally, but what's interesting was the interrogation of what students were doing. We saw much less drill and repetition, whether that be worksheets or answering questions out of a book, and we saw a greater student activity and therefore less student engagement, because the teachers and the students were much more active, engaged in more and different learning at the same time and not the same activity as was observed in the pre. Because there was greater difference, the teacher was moving more, moving around the room, therefore students were moving around the room, therefore there was less instance where students would be sitting waiting and therefore getting off task. So this breakdown gives you an understanding of how the teachers use their technology in the two environments. What was surprising and was not expected was the decrease in the teacher use of technology. Given that these spaces were designed with the affordances of digital technology at its heart, it was interesting to see that in both faculties the staff or the teachers used their devices less. And that's mirrored in the reduced use of the front data projector, and that correlates with the decrease in direct instruction where the teacher is disseminating content to students through notes. There was less of that activity and there was much more active participation or active facilitation by the teacher, where they would be moving around the room helping individual students or groups. We saw much more informal learning, so that's lacking that structure of a normal classroom where there are students engaged in different activities in different spaces. We saw a greater use of the outside design studio spaces. You saw that in the earlier photo where you had the outside the classroom was a lounge, or we called it the design lounge. So there was greater use of the outside classroom space by the teacher. So the teacher was actually leaving their classroom to work with students. In terms of student use of technology, it was fairly comparable in terms of actual, how much students were using their technology, pen and paper and tablet in art, we did see a slight decrease in pen and paper and design technology, but an increase in tablet. Now that was attributed in design technology to the prevalence of CAD work, and what we saw was that in the design technology workshops there was a greater use of automation of tools such as 3D printers, laser cutters, and in those particular with those particular tools, it requires students to create a CAD design and actually put that into the laser cutter or the 3D printer, and it actually creates that artifact. We also saw, again with the students, much more prevalence of different learning modes. So we saw students in and out of the classrooms, working with different people more often. Surprisingly, the internet was not used that much in either subject, and in the main the internet was really used as a resource or a research for research purposes. So in conclusion, what was interesting about this particular study was its focus on the trends between one space and the other. Of note, there was a significant decrease in teacher-centered chalk and talk to a whole class grouping, which were doing the same activity at the same time, and that was a big factor in the active pedagogy that we saw in the new Creative Precinct. By allowing students to work on different activities at the same time, we got a much more diverse range of student learning opportunities, which then supported the notion of having different student groupings. And by doing that, where the teacher is an active facilitator, we saw much less student disengagement. The fact is, it was very difficult for students to be disengaged while they waited for the activity to move at a fairly lockstep pace, which is what we saw in the traditional space. Because it was so dynamic and people were moving quite often, it was very difficult for the students just to sit there and wait and therefore become disengaged. The greater prevalence of differentiation or multiple learning activities can be seen in the range of student learning opportunities in the particular lesson. And what was interesting was that the space was designed to have multiple learning spaces, and you can see that in the photos where there were the gallery space with the art was more than what would be termed a hallway. It was actually a learning space, and to have inside and outside learning spaces, even though it's still housed within the building, actually allows teachers to differentiate the activity, allow those students who are more able to move on, and actually provide assistance to the individuals that need assistance much easier. What was interesting, obviously, was we didn't expect the teacher use of technology to decrease. That was interesting, given the building was designed in that particular fashion, but that was basically attributed to teachers spending less time feeding content out through their digital device. And also what was interesting was the increase of pen and paper in some of the subjects. Given that the building was all about digital technology, the fact is that pen and paper and digital technology were being used in increased amounts was very positive, and it goes to show that it's not an either or, but it's an and proposition. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation today. I hope you have found it informative, and if you have any further questions, please contact me at either my University of Melbourne or Churchie email address.